Senator Brown.
Thank you, Madam Deputy President. I rise to speak on the National Disability Insurance Scheme Amendment Strengthening Banning Orders Bill 2020. Labor welcomes the introduction of the National Disability Bill that we have before the Senate here today. The bill seeks to broaden the circumstances in which the NDIS Quality and Safeguards Commission may make a banning order against a provider or person and clarifies the Commission's powers. The bill addresses some timing issues and shortfalls in the NDIS Commissioner's ability to make banning orders against a worker, including that the Commissioner does not have power to issue a banning order against a person who is no longer employed or engaged by the NDIS provider. The Commissioner does not have power to make a preemptive banning order against a person, whether an individual or otherwise, who has been identified as unsuitable to work with people with disability as a result of their actions in another field, such as aged care or childcare. The changes would allow a Commissioner to make a banning order against a provider's former employee or other staff and prevent lapse of a banning order if the employee ceases to be engaged by the provider or the provider leaves the sector. The amendments will also empower the Commissioner to include detail of the order, including enough information to identify the person in the publicly available NDIS provider register. Privacy concerns are addressed in the explanatory memorandum, which notes that highly sensitive or personal information or details of the nature of the incident that prompted the exclusion will not be included on the register. Labor notes that once passed by Parliament, amendments will apply immediately to any person, regardless of when they cease to be engaged in working with people with a disability. Labor notes that in the first reading of this bill, Minister for the National Disability Insurance Scheme, Mr Stuart Roberts, stated that, and I quote, "The recent tragic circumstances surrounding the death of Anne-Marie Smith in South Australia have highlighted just how important it is to have the strongest possible protections available for NDIS participants." End quote. Anne-Marie Smith was a 50-year-old Adelaide NDIS participant who died on April 6 of severe septic shock, multiple organ failure, severe pressure sores, malnutrition and issues connected with her cerebral palsy after being confined to a cane chair 24 hours a day for more than a year. 24 hours a day for more than a year. Anne-Marie Smith's NDIS package included 6 hours of support per day. Reports are that she only received 2 hours of care per day and had not been seen outside her house in years. Anne-Marie's terrible death is nothing short of a tragedy. She should be alive and thriving. Instead, she was neglected, abandoned, and she died. This is the nightmare of every parent with an adult child with disability. Anne-Marie was failed in life. Labor therefore agrees with the Minister's statement and acknowledges that Anne-Marie's death was likely prompted the identification of the gaps in this legislation in which this legislation seeks to address. In that sense, Labor is supportive of the changes. However, the bill does not address the issue at the core of Anne-Marie Smith's death. If these amendments were in place while the abuse was occurring, they would not have prevented Anne-Marie's death because the care worker, Miss Maoni, was an employee at the time of the abuse. That means there is something else not working in the system. Shortly after his appointment in 2018, the inaugural NDIS Quality and Safeguards Commissioner Graham Head gave a speech to the CEDA in which he said, and I quote, "We're able to take a range of actions, including deregistration, banning orders, or seeking the application of civil penalties, so we really do have a comprehensive toolkit. We have a comprehensive regulatory powers and functions and real regulatory teeth." Incidences that must be reported to the Commission include the death of a participant, serious injury, abuse or neglect, and importantly, also the unauthorised use of restrictive practice in relation to a participant. It does represent a significant step change in how we approach the delivery of quality services to people with disability and how we protect and prevent neglect and abuse of people with disability. It represents a significant raising of the bar in terms of how we think about quality and safeguards in this sector." End quote. These comments have not aged well. If the Commissioner has real teeth, why did Anne-Marie's service provider only receive a fine of $12,600 after allowing her carer to neglect her so severely? If the Commission has real regulatory powers and functions, why wasn't it overseeing the care that Anne-Marie was meant to be receiving? The government must provide answers to these questions and outline what it intends to do to ensure that the Commission's powers are being properly used to prevent abuse and neglect, not just a slap on the wrist after the fact. The National Disability Insurance Scheme is a vital national service, but after 7 years of Liberal rule, it has been slashed and mismanaged to such an extent that people are dying of neglect in their homes. The Minister needs to get real and start acting in the interests of Australians with disability. This kind of system failure resulting in death by neglect needs to be approached head-on with honesty and genuine reform. David Harris was found dead in his Parramatta unit and had been found dead after 2 months before his body was discovered by police. And after he was found by authorities, his grieving sister, based interstate, learnt David's NDIS funding had been cut off because he missed an annual review meeting. This meant cleaners and other NDIS-funded support stopped visiting the 55-year-old who was schizophrenic, diabetic, incontinent and needed regular injections. How many Australians with disability have to die in their homes before the government and the minister admit there is a problem and confronts the issues head-on with honesty and transparency? The minister has so far presided over $4.6 billion ripped out of the NDIS, 1,200 Australians with disability dying while waiting to be funded by the scheme. And after her brother David's tragic death, Leanne Longfellow asked one thing of Mr Robert: that case managers be introduced to the NDIS. He wrote back saying there are no plans to do that. Labor was relieved when the Morrison government heeded Labor's calls for independent investigation into the death of Anne-Marie Smith. Labor has argued that it should have been broadened to also look at what went wrong in the case of David Harris. Just as loved ones of Ms Smith deserve to know that others will not be the victims of failings in the system, so do the loved ones of Mr Harris. Why the legislation is a good start. The current scope of the inquiry, the NDIS Quality and Safeguard Commission's regulations or lack thereof, Ms Smith's provider. If you have a look at the inquiry as that was put in place, Ms Smith's service provider, Integrity Care, was clearly limited. The inquiry needed to be free to look at broader considerations, such as whether the $30 million a year commission had been a toothless watchdog across multiple cases, not just Ms Smith's provider, and whether deaths in homes of NDIS participants by neglect has been exacerbated by the removal of $4.6 billion from the scheme by this government. There also remains a clear residual conflict of the Commission appointing the investigator and the investigator reporting back to the subject of his inquiry. The investigator needed subpoena powers, which Mr Robinson did not have, and disability advocates should be supported if they wish to engage with the process. We also welcome the appointment of an investigator who at least can separate from who is separate from the NDIA and the NDIS Quality and Safeguards Commission. This is an improvement on the NDIS Minister Stuart Roberts' previous approach of burying his head in the sand, albeit a change only brought about by public pressure. Now the government must do the right thing by the memory of David Harris and Anne-Marie Smith. After Labor called for an independent inquiry into the NDIS Quality and Safeguarding, the NDIS Quality and Safeguard Commission tasked former Federal Justice Mr Alan Robinson with reviewing the adequacy of the regulation of the supports and services provided to Ms Anne-Marie Smith. The report does not identify any failings in how the NDIS Quality and Safeguards Commission carried out its function around Anne-Marie Smith's death. Why is that? The Quality and Safeguard Commission didn't fail because the scope of the inquiry is too narrow. The review found there was no wrongdoing with the Commission, which is set up to protect the NDIS participants. It issued the NDIS Quality and Safeguarding Commission issued a fine of $12,600 for failing to notify the Commission of Anne-Marie's death within 24 hours, a month and a half after she died. And as far as we know, this is the only fine the Commission has issued against a provider since it set up in 2018. A banning order to the provider, Integrity Care, 4 months after she died. We now know that this is the only infringement that the Commission has ever issued in 2 years of operation. In the course of this review, Mr Robinson did take the opportunity to consider wider issues of safeguarding of people with disability who are particularly vulnerable, and he issued 10 broad-ranging recommendations. The report clearly shows that the Commission and the NDIS safeguarding framework is not set up to effectively protect people on the NDIS. Now, the inquiry did issue broad-ranging recommendations which I urge the government to take up and which they have failed to do in the legislation that we have before us. The Senate should note that the government introduced legislation in June, and if Rosemary Meone, the Anne-Marie Smith's support worker, was not arrested, she would still be working 9 months later. It's appalling. It's terrible. And the report highlights buck passing between the NDIA and the NDIS Quality and Safeguarding Commission. The legislation before us needs to be amended to actually give real teeth to the NDIS Quality and Safeguarding Commission, because at the moment they are failing in their duty.